The key to rebuilding the Falcons defense may be landing a couple of Jets.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer subscriber, follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we are talking about the decisions that the Falcons have to make in restricted free agency with Ryan Nuzul and some other players. But the main focus of today's episode will be talking about the potential corners and linebackers the Falcons could target in free agency. And that conversation has to start with some players that spent the last couple of years playing for new Falcons defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich in New York. And I think there are 3 Jets defensive, we'll call them cast-offs, although I probably the Jets would like to keep all of these guys, but they may walk in free agency. And 3 of those guys that I think could really help the Falcons defense is linebacker Jamie and Sherwood, cornerback DJ Reed, and defensive back extraordinaire Isaiah Oliver. Now with Jamie and Sherwood, I think he would be the prize for the Atlanta Falcons in this free agent cycle, right? I'd be very disappointed in the offseason if the Falcons don't land him. He's kind of the guy at the top of the board. He's the whatever it takes guy for me this offseason. And the everydayers may recall we had Jesse Bates as the whatever it takes guys, and we were playing the Avengers Endgame scene whenever we were ever talking about it, where we had to do whatever we had to take, whatever it took to get to land Jesse Bates, and we were successfully able to do that. We didn't quite have that player last offseason. The player that by default would be that player was Kirk Cousins, just because I'd spent 4 weeks telling you on the podcast that the Falcons were going to sign Kirk Cousins. So I was invested in being right, but not necessarily in the sense of, this is going to be a game-changing move for the Falcons. It was the first of many moves that we hoped would be game-changing moves for the Falcons. And the Falcons are like, no, this is the only move we need to make, but we're not going to go down that road again on today's episode. So Jamie and Sherwood is an interesting player. His story is that he played safety at Auburn. He was a 5th-round pick for the Jets in 2021. They spent 3 years as a backup developing him, playing special teams. But then this past year got an opportunity to start with CJ Mosley going down with an injury, and he took advantage of that opportunity and was quietly one of the best linebackers in the NFL this past year. He's a do-it-all linebacker. He checks every box that you're looking for at that spot next to Caden Ellis. You're looking for a guy that has coverage ability, speed, range, smart instincts, can play downhill, can play sideline to sideline, even though he's a former safety, there's no lack of physicality. He sees a 320-pound offensive lineman in his way. He has no problem going through him. Nick Emmanwori could never, your fave. But the other thing about Jamie and Sherwood is he just turned 25, and this is the guy that theoretically, if the Falcons were able to land him, could be that fixture in the middle of their defense for the next 5 years, right? It mirrors a little bit of what the signing was of Caden Ellis 2 years ago, where he was a guy that was, a guy that steadily improved across 4 years in New Orleans, had that breakout year in a contract year, and you've seen him turn into one of the fixtures in the Falcons defense the last 2 seasons. Mirrors the Jesse Bates signing, given the youth, right? I'm not going to sit here and say Jamie and Sherwood's going to be the Falcons quote-unquote MVP of their defense like Jesse Bates has been the last 2 years, but if there is a free agent that they could add that could approach that type of value to the Falcons defense, I do think Jamie and Sherwood would be your best bet. And so if there's one free agent that is worth the Falcons to splurge on this offseason, I think Jamie and Sherwood is that guy. Pro Football Focus projects his contract to be, $7.775 million per year. That feels like they're lowballing that projection. Zach Bond just got paid on Wednesday by the Eagles, got, I think, $17 million a year on that contract. I figured even before the Zach Bond deal came down that the floor for Sherwood was probably going to be like $12 million a year. So, if that settles around like $15-16 million a year, I still think that's worth it just based off of how Sherwood played this past year, and if that continues. So we'll see if the Falcons can land that big fish. Another potential big name Jets player is DJ Reed, has been one of the best CB2s in the NFL the past 3 years, playing opposite Sauce Gardner, and given Sauce's presence and teams, quarterbacks, unwillingness to test DJ Reed, Sauce Gardner, they tend to test DJ Reed a lot more, and he's been able to lock down his side of the field as well as you could possibly expect. He can play both man, he can play zone, he's a competent tackler. I just recently watched the Jets-Vikings game last night to watch Sherwood and some of these other Jets free agents, and, I wouldn't say he shut him down, but relative to what the Falcons DBs did against Jordan Addison this past year, he shut down Jordan Addison. And so you just got to compare that and like, I need that. We're playing the Vikings again this year. So it's like, we need somebody who can handle Jordan Addison, and DJ Reed is certainly that guy. So, the real cases against signing DJ Reed is age and money, right? He's going to be 28 this year. We know cornerbacks tend to slow down around age 30. Some have been able to play at a high level beyond age 30, but in general, it's tough to count on corners playing at a high level beyond age 30. And then money-wise, he's could potentially be the highest paid CB2 in the NFL and get paid, some people think, like a CB1, right? PFF is projecting him at $14 million a year. I figure high-end CB2 money is about 12 to 16 million a year, and low-end CB1 money is like 17, 18, 19 million a year. We just paid AJ Terrell $20 million a year this past summer. And so do you want to pay that type of cash and devote that many resources to the cornerback position, especially with Reed? You're only going to get probably 2, maybe 3 years of high level production. So that's your mileage may vary, depends on where you fall in that. I can see it both ways, but if you want to see this defense get better sooner versus later, and I think most of us want to see that, I think it's probably worth it to sink that much money into the cornerback position, especially when you play in a division that has 2 teams that have 2 quality receivers in the Saints and the Bucks. And who knows what the Panthers are going to do with that top 10 pick this year, and maybe they add another quality receiver to their mix. And so having 2 capable cornerbacks is going to help you win your division. 2 capable cornerbacks, if you do wind up winning the division and making the playoffs, are going to help you win playoff games, because you play in a conference where you got to deal with the Eagles receivers and the Vikings receivers and some of these other teams that have multiple receivers. And we saw last year, whenever the Falcons played a team with more than one good receiver, this secondary really had problems, and DJ Reed would potentially solve that problem. So you guys know how I stand on it. The salary cap is a lie. You kind of figure it out later, win games and figure it out later. It's sort of my philosophy, but I'm not so naive to think that the Falcons are just going to start backing up all the Brinks trucks this offseason, given their cap situation. It's not as dire as I think some people paint it as. They should have no problem getting to like $25 million to $30 million under the salary cap without necessarily doing anything crazy that's going to mortgage their future or anything like that. But and that should allow them to be competitive on some of these deals. But when you look at, some of these guys that are potentially going to be making around $15 million, again, give or take a couple of million, guys like Sherwood, guys like DJ Reed, guys like Drew Dahlman, if the Falcons are hoping to retain him, how many of those $15 million a year contracts are they willing to throw around this offseason? 1, 2, probably not 3. So that's really the debate. And so if I'm ranking them based off of my personal preference, we'll see what the Falcons' preference is going to be. I would rank them in terms of my willingness to hand out similar contracts around that $15 million range. I would rank Sherwood 1, I would rank Reed 2, and then I would probably rank Dahlman 3 on that list. But I'm sure the Falcons will probably have Dahlman a little bit higher. So we'll see on that front. And the last Jet we want to talk about is Isaiah Oliver. This is a reunion in order. So if you're new to the fan base or you're not a Falcon fan and you're listening to the podcast, welcome. But Isaiah Oliver was originally drafted in the 2nd round by the Falcons back in 2018. He struggled his first 2 years as an outside corner. They moved him to nickel in year 3. He started to blossom. He played really well at the first month of 2021 before an ACL tear ended his season. Came back in 2022, was solid, not spectacular. Signed with the 49ers in 23, struggled that year, was scooped up by the Jets this past year, and was fine, right? Like that's kind of what Isaiah Oliver is. He's a role player, a versatile chess piece in your secondary. You can have him upgrade the nickel cornerback spot. He can play some safety. He dabbled at that in Atlanta in the last couple of years in New York and San Francisco. You can use him really as a dime sort of defender that can cover tight ends and slot receivers and all that stuff. It's basically the role that the Falcons have had Trey Flowers and Kevin King manning these last 2 years. And I think Oliver is just a better version of those players. So in the best case scenario, you bring back Isaiah Oliver. He's going to be an upgrade at the nickel cornerback position. At worst, I think he's going to be an upgrade at the dime back position as that sixth defensive back that can play sort of a hybrid corner safety role. And so the good thing about that is I don't think you're going to have to stretch, to pay a premium $2-3 million a year on a modest contract. So I think Isaiah Oliver is going to give you a lot of bang for your buck and be a definite upgrade in your secondary and give you some added versatility. So those are the Jets castoffs that I'm hoping the Falcons will be eager to pursue. We'll see how eager they are to do that. And if those guys will follow Jeff Ulbrich down here to Atlanta. And I think, I feel optimistic at this point in time. Maybe it's naively optimistic, but because we hired Jeff Ulbrich, who is a linebackers guy, because we hired Mike Rutenberg as the defensive passing game coordinator, who was the Jets linebackers coach, who coached and developed Jamie and Sherwood, I feel like that gives us a leg up, even if necessarily the Falcons aren't maybe as primed to win an outright bidding award for Jamie and Sherwood, but I think they are good enough in a good enough cap situation to make a competitive offer for him, and just rejoining his old coaches and sort of being, one of the forces in the Falcons middle of the defense, I think would be, enough to lure him. But maybe I'm being naive in that, and he's looking to cash in or whatever. But we'll see on that front. But, it's not just the Jets corners and linebackers that the Falcons could pursue. There are others that they could add this offseason. We'll break some of those guys down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So you've probably heard of Chewy, and they really do have everything you need to keep your pet happy and healthy. And whether you're shopping for food treats or even pet healthcare, Chewy's going to make it fast, easy, and affordable. With over 100,000 products from all your favorite brands, Chewy has everything your pet needs, from food and treats to toys, beds, grooming. And it's not just for dogs, cats. They've got supplies for birds, fish, reptiles, small pets, even llamas, guys. So Chewy is going to make it easy to help manage your pet's health with prescriptions and telehealth, vet visits, and in-person vet clinics that are rolling out nationwide. And their auto ship feature is a game changer, where you can set up automatic deliveries for food treats or any other essentials before you ever run out. And of course, you can change and cancel it anytime you want. Chewy has everything you need to keep your pet healthy and happy. And right now you can save $20 on your first order and get free shipping when you go to chewy.com or click the link in the description. Save $20 on your first order with free shipping by clicking the link in the description. Minimum purchase required. New customers only. Terms and conditions apply. See site for complete details. So let's talk about some other potential options at cornerback and linebacker. And as I explained on yesterday's episode, when we broke down the free agent wish list of the defensive front, the Falcons historically under Terry Fontenot, their general manager, have primarily targeted free agents that have connections with the current coaching staff. And so we'll be focusing mainly on those guys that have those connections, but we'll mention a couple of other guys that are at least prominent free agents at some of these positions that maybe the Falcons could pursue. And so when we look at the cornerback position, Rasul Douglas is a guy that has a coaching connection, played with Jerry Gray, the Falcons defensive coach, and their secondary coach, Justin Hood, in Green Bay from 21 to 23. He most spent 24 with the Buffalo Bills after being traded there midway through the 23 season. Very productive ball hawk, journeyman player, has been on 7 teams in 8 years, 2.5 years in Green Bay, had 10 interceptions during that stint. I've always been a fan of Rasul Douglas from his days in Philadelphia. He always felt like he got a raw deal. I thought every time I watched him, I thought he was a productive player, but for whatever reason, Philadelphia was never willing to commit to him. He eventually lands in Green Bay in 2021, has 5 interceptions, 2 pick sixes that year, and basically no one's really questioned him since then. He's been a starter ever since. The big knock on Rasul is he's going to be 30 in August, and probably his best years are behind him. But as a ball hawking zone corner, there's a chance that he'll be able to extend that beyond the age of 30 and still be a productive player. Eric Stokes is another former Packer, also a local from Georgia, had a very promising rookie season, then was hurt the next 2 years, was healthier this past year, played better from what I understand, but still wasn't necessarily good. Wasn't back to his pre-injury form. And to me, Eric Stokes is kind of a Mike Hughes-esque bet as a former first-round pick. Maybe you sign him to a cheap one-year deal as a reclamation project, come in and compete for that spot opposite AJ Terrell at that outside cornerback spot. And, maybe a competition between him if you're able to re-sign Mike Hughes as well as a rookie. That kind of works for me, but I'm not necessarily willing to give that more than like a one-year prove-it deal for like maybe $5-6 million at this stage, given that Eric Stokes hasn't been great the last 3 years. And then the other former Packer is Jaire Alexander. And we say former Packer because he's still officially on the Packers, but he's been shot being traded. And I think the Falcons, if maybe not trading for him, but probably scooping him up potentially if they do cut him, if they can't find a trade partner, I'd be interested in that. Jaire is still on the right side of 30. He's 28, just turned 28. And in fact, the main issue with Jaire Alexander, who's been one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL for the last 5 years, has been injuries. He has not been healthy. He's missed 10 games in each of the last 2 seasons. He's missed 34 combined games over the last 4 seasons. The way that my good buddy Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers would tell you that, the reason why he's missed so much time is not because he's been unable to play. He's been unwilling to play, right? I'm not going to get into that because I don't know enough about that, but availability is the best ability, and the Packers coaches apparently, at least according to Peter, have not been happy with Jaire's willingness to be available. So what we know about Jaire, maybe a change of ceiling would change his motives or whatever, but we know that when he's healthy, he's one of the best corners in the NFL. And so to me, that's why I'm willing to risk that, or if you want to call it that, because the upside is huge. And so, the only issue is if you're going to go down that Jaire Alexander road, you got to have a plan B, because there's a good chance that whoever his backup is going to wind up starting the majority of the season based off of how the last couple of seasons have gone. Now, some players that do not have a coaching connection that I think is worth mentioning when we talk about potential starting outside corners opposite AJ Terrell in free agency, Paulson Adebo from the Saints makes sense as a potential swing. His play can be a little bit up and down, but he has good size, athleticism to be able to match up in man coverage, sound tackler for the most part that can handle zone stuff. The big concern with Adebo is he's coming off a broken femur, right? Which is not a very common injury in the NFL. It's not a very common injury in life, because for those of you that don't know, your femur is the hardest bone in your body. It's basically as hard as concrete. And so a lot of force has to be generated in order to break that bone. And so because that's not an injury that is very common, there isn't a lot of precedent of like we know with like ACLs and Achilles and torn labrums and, all these other injuries, we those happen all the time. So we kind of know what the general timetable and what the recovery looks like and how guys respond to it and whatnot. You don't really know that with the broken femur. And so I think if that's the case, you want to try to get him on a 1 year or like a cheap prove it deal, or cheaper, let's say, prove it deal. He's only going to be 26. I think he's going to turn 26 in July. So there is upside there if he does wind up bouncing back from that injury. Now, of course, another option for the Falcons at that outside cornerback spot is, just re-sign Mike Hughes and then go into the draft and hope you can find your long-term answer there. The nickel cornerback spot is another problem area. I couldn't find too many impending free agents that have obvious coaching connections besides Isaiah Oliver, as I mentioned earlier. But at least one player that I'd be a big fan of if the Falcons did sign him, a guy that's on a little bit of the older side, is Mike Hilton. He's from the Atlanta area. He's spent the last 3-4 years with the Bengals. He's been quietly, I think, one of the best nickel cornerbacks in the NFL, even going back to his days in Pittsburgh for the last 7-8 years. If you want a guy that can cover and also be a force against the run, Mike Hilton is just chef's kiss. This man has more TFLs, tackles for loss, in the last 2 years than Jalen Carter does. So the only knock on Mike Hilton at this point is he's going to turn 31, I think, next week. But maybe there's a chance that being a nickel might extend your NFL career beyond that age 30 mark that we talked about earlier. I can think of guys like Chris Harris and Jason McCourty, that were able to maintain a decent level of play to age 33, 34, mainly as nickel cornerback. So maybe Mike Hilton still has, 2-3 more good years left in him. Moving on to the linebacker position, the biggest linebacker free agent that has a coaching connection is Ernest Jones. We're not going to count Bobby Wagner. Ernest Jones played for Raheem with the Rams, so did Bobby Wagner for one season, but we're not counting Bobby Wagner. He's looking for like one last chance to win a ring or whatever he's trying to do. Which, we would like to believe is in Atlanta, but he's not the type of player that we're looking for. Now, Jones is young. He's only 25. He had a weird 2024 because the Rams basically we're not going to pay you in going into your contract year. So they traded him to the Titans at the beginning of the season. Then the Titans traded him to the Seahawks midway through the season. From the sounds of it, he played really well for the Seahawks, and they're going to prioritize re-signing him. So whether he makes it to market is an open question at this point in time. The issue with Jones is his and Caden Ellis' skill sets are very similar, right? They're both kind of functional in coverage, but not really, great there. Jones is that downhill player. He had his best year in 2023. Raheem's last year there, where he was used a lot as a blitzer on a lot of those sim pressures that they were bringing. We saw Caden Ellis lead all off-ball linebackers and pressures this past year. Jones was the guy who led all off-ball linebackers and pressures in 2023. I feel like him and Ellis are too redundant. So it to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense for the Falcons to sign him, given that we're looking for more of a coverage guy. But this is potentially the final year of Caden Ellis' contract. He'll be 30. So there could be a case to be made to swap out the old with the new, and you bring in Jones with the idea that he'll be the Caden Ellis for the next 3 to 5 years, like Caden Ellis has been for the last 2 plus this year to make 3 years. Now, someone who's more of a coverage guy is Dre Greenlaw with the 49ers. Brings that more of that complementary skill set. Before his Achilles tear that happened in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs back last year. He was considered one of the top coverage linebackers in the NFL. So he popped that Achilles in the Super Bowl, missed most of this year, came back late this year, led to some Devontae Campbell drama. Google it if you don't know. The thing with the Achilles, we know that it's not the year after you tear it, it's the year after where guys usually recover from it. So this year, 2025 is the year where you're hoping Dre Greenlaw to look a lot more like the pre-Achilles tear Dre Greenlaw, which again was one of the best coverage linebackers in the NFL. So it would be a worthwhile bet for the Falcons based off of that, but it does seem like the 49ers are going to prioritize re-signing him, and so it would not shock me at all if they are able to keep him off the market between now and Monday. The other linebacker I think worth keeping an eye on is Jermaine Pratt. He does have a coaching connection with senior defensive assistant Dave Huxtable from their shared days at NC State. Pratt is expected to be cut by the Bengals. He's already requested a trade. We'll see if anybody trades for him. I hope the Falcons don't trade for him. Wait till him to get cut, right? It's the reverse of the Kirk Cousins situation. Pratt's not a guy that's going to get you excited, but he's a competent starter. He had a very big 2022 when he had a contract year, got paid, and kind of reverted to being the average linebacker that he was prior to 2022. And he's middling is probably what I would call him, just because like his play tends to be very up and down. And so it kind of averages out to being average, right? And so, if the Falcons were to miss out on Sherwood, if they were to miss out on Greenlaw, then it is down to guys like Jermaine Pratt and Jerome Baker and Kaiser White. And probably at that point, you're probably hoping that the Falcons are going to solve their linebacker needs in the draft. So another reason why I think it's important that they are able to land that big fish in Jamie and Sherwood. So we'll see, when it comes to these external free agents that the Falcons could be bringing to Atlanta. But let's talk about some internal guys that they have some important decisions to make on, and that we're going to be focusing on restricted free agency because, most years no one cares about restricted free agency, but this year, at least with the Falcons, it's a little bit more relevant than it is most years. And I'll explain why as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the Falcons have 6 restricted free agents this year: Ryan Newsel, Nate Landman, D. Alford, Liam McCullough, Kyle Hinton, and Harrison Hand. McCullough to me is a no-brainer multi-year extension. The highest paid long snapper in the NFL makes about $1.6 million a year. So to me, go ahead, give Liam McCullough a 5-year deal for like $7 or $8 million and set it and forget it. I think there's a conversation to be had about the rest of these guys. and what you do with them. And for those of you that don't know what restricted free agency and how it's different from unrestricted free agency, unrestricted free agents, once we get to the league year on next week on March 12th, guys will be free to sign with anybody. Of course, they will have 2 days starting on Monday to begin those negotiation in the legal tampering period. But, restricted free agents, unrestricted free agents are guys that have 4 or more years of NFL experience. Restricted free agents are guys that only have 3 years of NFL experience. And so teams have to make a decision on those guys whether to tender them, which is basically a 1-year contract offer at a specified price point. And if a team doesn't tender you, then you become an unrestricted free agent. And Harrison Hand is the one player that I would say is very likely to suffer that fate of not being tendered and becoming an unrestricted free agent. I believe Felipe Franks was the last time we had a restricted free agent, or the last time I remember a restricted free agent, and they let him go to unrestricted free agency. There are 3 levels of tenders, right? The lowest level is the original pick level. It's $3.26 million roughly. The second level is the second round level. That's 5.35. And then the top level is the first round, which is 7.46 this year. And those levels indicate the compensation that the original team would get if another team was to sign those restricted free agents away. The original pick is based off of where that guy was originally drafted. So if he was a 5th round pick originally, then you would get a 5th round pick back. Second round, obviously get a second, first, right? So restricted free agents, they can sign offer sheets with new teams, right? They can negotiate like an unrestricted free agent, and then they can agree to an offer sheet. And then their old team, in this case, the Falcons, would have the right of first refusal, which means that they have 7 days to either match the contract or let the guy walk, right? And if they let them walk, that's when they get that compensation based off of the pick on the level that they were tendered. Since most restricted free agents nowadays are former undrafted free agents, that original pick is nothing. You get no compensation if those guys sign elsewhere, right? Because nowadays drafted players sign, a 4-year contract, so they skip over the restricted phase, and undrafted players sign the 3-year contracts that if they do make the team and survive, they will wind up being restricted. So if you tender guys at the lowest level, you'll get nothing. That seems scary, but it should be noted that restricted free agency has been rarely used over the last 20 years. I think the last time a restricted free agent signed with a new team, changed teams, was in 2017 when the Patriots signed running back Mike Gillislee. The previous year, the Patriots also signed wide receiver Chris Hogan. And then I want to say, maybe I'm missing an example in between those years, but prior to that, the previous time before that was also the Patriots, signing Wes Welker and then ultimately negotiating a trade for him in 2007. So, now that Bill Belichick's in Chapel Hill, I don't think you have to be worried about anybody minding your restricted free agents, but we'll see. Teams tend to still be rather safe than sorry. And so the Falcons have 4 guys they got to figure out: Newsel, Alford, Landman, and Hinton. I'd be surprised if the Falcons tendered Hinton. I think you can let him be an unrestricted free agent and then maybe re-sign him on a veteran minimum deal and save some money. I'd probably do the same thing with Landman at this stage. But knowing the Falcons, they'll probably tender him at the $3.2 million level as a backup. To me, that's too expensive for what Nate Landman is, right? For a special teams player that is basically a middling special teams player up to this point. But we'll see what the Falcons do on that. Newsel, given the situation with Drew Dahlman, the possibility of losing him is the situation I'm referring to. I'm certain that Newsel will get tendered. It's just a question of whether they tender him at the original pick level or the second round level, right? And so I think they could tender him at the second round level just to be safe, to make sure that they retain him, because no team's going to trade a second round pick for Ryan Newsel. And so that would mean that he'd be back on a 1-year, $5.33 million deal. And that to me would be a strong indicator that the Falcons are looking at Ryan Newsel as the front runner to start at center this year. If they tender him at the lower level at 3.2, that would mean they probably are looking for more help at that position, because that's high end backup money for an offensive lineman. Alford is going to depend on what the Falcons' plan is at nickel quarterback, and that could determine what level he's tendered at. I'd expect them to tender him at the lowest level at 3.2. But if they are going to prioritize the nickel cornerback spot, it wouldn't shock me if they don't tender him. But we'll see on that front. So I think the questions for the Falcons with the restricted free agents are going to be, how aggressive are they going to want to be to kind of pinch pennies? Because you can do that with restricted free agents, right? That if you don't tender a guy and re-sign him to a veteran minimum contract, like I suspect they'll do with Kyle Hinton, you would sign that guy to like a $1.2 million deal versus the $3.2 million deal that you would tender him at, that he would count towards this year's salary cap. So essentially you would save $2 million by not tendering that guy and offering him a vet minimum contract. And of course, when you're potentially tendering 3 or 4 guys, that's $6 to $8 million of savings that you could potentially reap if you're willing to, quote unquote, take the risk and try to pinch those pennies. And so that's the dance that I'm referring to when it comes to the restricted free agent stuff. The probability of another team signing one of these guys, if you try to do that, whether it's pinching pennies or having the lowest tenders possible on these guys, is very low, but it's not zero, right? And so the question is, are teams willing to risk that? Is saving $2 million worth that risk? And again, we'll see what the Falcons wind up doing. So to recap, I think Ryan Nuzul will certainly be tendered. It's just a question of, is it at the $5.3 million level or the $3.2 million level? Alford and Landman are a little bit more up in the air, but I think it's the high probability that they'll be tendered at the $3.2 million level. Hinton and Hand probably won't be tendered, but I could see them re-signing Hinton regardless. Personally, I would just re-sign Elijah Wilkinson over Kyle Hinton, but the Falcons don't know as much ball as I do, so they want to make that mistake. Be my guess. And then Liam McCullough should hopefully get a long-term deal, and you would still save roughly about the same million, because I'm imagining he'd only count maybe like $1.2, $1.3 million against cap this year. So that's one way to save money and, set it and forget it when you're a long snapper and all that stuff. So, they have until March 12th to decide what to do with the restricted free agents when the league year starts. But sometimes that news leaks out early. Like, for example, it was announced I think yesterday on Tuesday that the Bears are not going to tender their backup linebacker, Jack Sanborn, or I guess their third linebacker, Jack Sanborn. And that will mean that he'll be an unrestricted free agent. And maybe that makes Jack Sanborn an option for the Falcons should they not necessarily land, do whatever it takes to land Jamie and Sherwood or another big fish at that linebacker position. So he may be also on the table at that linebacker spot. But that is it, guys. We'll talk more tomorrow with Jarvis Davis, get his thoughts on the ongoing Drew Dalman saga and whether he'll be back or whether he's going to walk and how the Falcons can replace him. We'll, talk about maybe who that whatever it takes free agent is for Jarvis, and whatever topics come up. That's all in store for you on Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft, where Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson are giving the scoop on all the biggest winners from the combine and getting you guys geared up for April's draft. While here on Locked On Falcons, we're wasting all of our time talking about free agency when we know the Falcons are not going to do anything, and I'm just going to be sitting here butthurt on the podcast next week. So Keith will get you guys geared up for that ahead of time before I eventually have to pivot towards the draft and be very disgruntled doing so. So check out Locked On NFL Draft podcast. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.